What a better way to start my presentation than to quote Reverend Riyad, who is sitting amongst us. I stopped him today and yesterday several times to ask him to provide me input for my presentation. He was generous enough to share with me the statement, which will really provide the context for everything I would say moving forward. Thank you, Reverend Riyad. I asked him what would be one message that he would like to give to his colleagues in the interfaith community, and he responded, "Interfaith conflict will lead to destruction of all of us, and only mutual respect and accepting the religious other will allow us to live together in peace and harmony." Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests and colleagues, thank you, Chetan, for the invitation to present as a scholar practitioner in the conflict resolution field on the role of religion and faith-based organizations in countering violent extremism. I know there is a lot of expertise in the room regarding that topic, and so please allow me to say that my presentation is definitely colored by my own experiences working in different parts of the world on interfaith and intercommunity conflicts, and especially in the Middle East, and as a member of the Abrahamic faith. My presentation represents more of a reflection on what I have observed working with interfaith organizations and with individuals and groups from different traditions. The rich presentations and discussions of panelists yesterday on many occasions touched upon the role of religion and faith in the lives of individuals and communities, and on how religion can be used either as a mitigating factor or can be mobilized to radicalize individuals. Without doubt, the topic of violent extremism has put the spotlight on faith-based organizations and the role in countering the abuse of religion by violent extremists to achieve their goals. It also involves and touches upon the role of the followers of the faith that embody its values and hold them deeply and are willing to defend them at any cost. Violent extremism and the perpetrators have certainly forced the conversation and forced us to look and investigate these disturbing social phenomena. And so if violent extremism should not be associated with any religion, as many of us say, nationality or civilization, and if it should not be tolerated or condoned, it begs the question as to why has the message of universal values of all religions on tolerance, understanding, dialogue, mutual respect, and inclusiveness failed and was co-opted by them. I would like to argue that before we take on the discussion, that we pause a little and ask perhaps of ourselves some difficult questions regarding inter- and interfaith relations. In spite of ongoing interfaith dialogue initiatives around the world and in various communities, tensions between the major religions continue to manifest in small and big ways. At least that's my observation. The attacks on the Rohingya community in Myanmar and the attacks on churches and places of worship of the Christian community in Iraq, Syria, and Egypt, including inflammatory language of intolerance by ISIS and other militant groups, Jewish extremism manifested in settler behavior in the Holy Land, the lack of acceptance of secularism and freedom of opinion regarding religious freedom, and the list goes on, truly warrants our attention. Ironically, it seems that ISIS is bringing us together, serving as a unifying factor. This external threat has forced a discussion on what religion can offer to counter such a phenomena, without which we have failed to either predict the current state of affairs or deal with it. And this raises, for me, the issue of accountability of religious communities. And therefore, allow me to take a few minutes to kind of share with you some of my observations. On some of the issues that I have observed is the lack of acknowledgement of the history of relationships between the different traditions and the failure to educate followers on the cost of the promotion of polarized rhetoric. In the absence of the space to process and address historical grievances, these historical grievances can always be used as trigger points to highlight differences, which eventually can lead to violent confrontations. I think it is a fact that intra and competition between and among the different traditions continues to frame the relationship, though it is only fair to say that existing efforts for collaboration are to be commended. I've also noticed that religious traditions have not taken enough responsibility for shaping the attitudes of their followers towards other communities of faith. Attitudes, in my humble opinion, are not created in a vacuum and are also rooted in culture, and we need to discuss that. In other cases, and in many cases, we find that violent extremism grows in and among faith communities where religious leaders are ill-equipped to deal with it. They do not have access to resources nor the necessary support to do so. They have cultural inhibitions that impedes their ability to identify resources in their community, such as women's role, as our dear panelist before us presented. Religious leaders may be ill-equipped to deal with violent extremism, as the previous panel has indicated, and because they lack the gender sensitivity and conflict sensitivity training, it seems to me their traditions or their beliefs are not enough to handle what is going on. We also notice that the dominance of patriarchal religious traditions that insist on delegating women to secondary role, in spite of all the evidence that men need the blessing of their mothers to go to war, continues to be unheard. The sad story, as one of our colleagues amongst you shared with me, of the ISIS leader killing his mother publicly for stopping him from fulfilling his duty to serve as a fighter for ISIS, shows how the demonization of women has been taken to a frightening level. Such acts do not happen in a vacuum. They are built on narratives of shame and women holding the honor of communities, and we need to reflect on that. In many countries, faith has also been used as an instrument of the state to control society. On many occasions, the state is very much in control over the religious institutions and occasionally use them in a way that it may appear that they have control over the state. This issue of governance certainly is impacting interfaith relations and faith-based organizations. On a more sensitive note, we all know that faith-based organizations, especially those with a global outreach, are often perceived with suspicion and doubt. Their followers feel that they are fulfilling their duties as members of the faith by sharing their faith and traditions in communities that are different than themselves. In such cases, the presence of such organizations is a direct cause of tension among the local communities, especially if the tradition is different than their own. In other cases, the outreach is political and based on larger political agendas, coupled perhaps with religious goals. For example, Yemen was mentioned a couple of times. The Wahhabi schools that were set up in the historical land of Saada, a historically Zaydi land, are at the root causes of some of the tension we have seen in Yemen lately. Another issue is the issue of financing and the sources of financing of religious-based institutions as a source of tension. For example, Western support of Christian communities has been perceived by some Muslim communities as an issue, and in conflict zones, when the Christian community is defended by the Western world, it is misinterpreted by the ignorant as a sign of Western alliance, forgetting that Christianity's roots are in the Arab world and that it is one of the earlier religious traditions preceding Islam. At the same time, Christian communities are worried about the funding of fundamental forms of Salafi Islam that leave no room for religious tolerance, let alone acceptance of the historical rights of diverse religious communities in the region. I'm so sorry to report personally, childhood friends that I grew up with report to me, and they are from the Christian community in Jordan, that they have reported having a suitcase ready should the situation in their home countries change to the worst. A sad development for the region as a whole. In spite of public statements and declarations and efforts of collaboration among the world religions, there is still a deficit in such efforts and on the strength and impact of them. The interfaith community needs to move forward on reconciling its own differences, first in order to model genuine collaboration and integration of its collective efforts. They, in my humble opinion, are not walking the talk to reflect the much-needed partnership to counter the root causes for radicalization. I cannot speak on behalf of all world religion, but as someone who grew up under the Abrahamic traditions, much work lies ahead of them. Mosques in Western countries were often staffed and funded by external financing from certain Arab countries, and with imams who did not grow up in the West, but rather grew up in the Middle East, bringing with them a worldview that does not serve the communities, struggling and juggling the pressures of growing up in cultures that are different than their countries of origin, and that of their parents and grandparents. Dealing with such issues should be the responsibilities of the imam, who should be culturally sensitive to the context they are operating in. In the context of the tragic events that we have been witnessing and the number of countries that have been adversely impacted and discussed throughout this conference, there is really much that we faith-based organizations and their leadership can do. Allow me to present you with a couple of thoughts on moving the conversation forward. But as one colleague sitting amongst us reminded me yesterday, as I was preparing for today's conversation, that we do not need to waste a good crisis to open the conversation. Faith-based organizations can open the space for people to come together to speak about timely issues, concerns, and challenges and opportunities. They need to open the space for women in leadership positions and fight with all the tools at their disposal and in partnership with women against gender-based violence. I think the previous panel did justice to the conversation. They can also serve as conveners for difficult conversations that deal with historical grievances. Utilize the power of restorative justice processes to bring justice as well as reconciliation to communities, and actually look within their respective traditions to the power of full examples of reconciliation and goodwill gestures. But also, to be honest, look into the text and narratives from their own traditions that promote violence and hate and exclusionary behaviors in their communities or support that behavior in their communities. Perhaps a starting point is to acknowledge the contextual and historical value of the stories, while also acknowledging the limitations of their application in a 21st century, where the context has changed and we are better equipped with additional knowledge. It's so important to keep the spiritual aspects of our faith and revisit the behaviors that have not reflected it correctly. Building trust with law enforcement agencies and the state is one way to also ensure that social justice and human rights and the protection of civil liberties is secure. I notice I'm out of time, so I'll rush a little bit. Also, visit the sense of entitlement on representing the truth and the only truth at the expense of other truth. This worldview is, again, feeding into attitudes and beliefs that are exclusionary and manipulated by others. We need to revisit them. We must hold religious institutions accountable for inflammatory rhetoric and go beyond condemnation to accountability. In an open letter from one of our dear colleagues, known by many of you, Daryl Byler, the director of the Center for Peace and Justice at Eastern Mennonite University, wrote an open letter to Gerald Fowler, the head of the Liberty University, who encouraged students after the San Bernardino events to arm themselves so they can, I quote, end those Muslims before they walked in, or teach them a lesson they ever show up. He reminded him again of how to deal with this conflict from a Christ-centered perspective. Faith-based communities can serve as educators, and they can definitely look at the factors and behaviors that are motivating the groups that we have been discussing for the past 2 days. I'm going to wrap up because I'm running out of time, but I can cover some of this when we meet together. I'd like to actually end with another quote that reads, and it's again from Daryl Byler, Let us work together to end all acts of violence and build a safer world. And he's addressing it again to the head of the university. Help create spaces where people from different faiths, nationalities, and race feel respected and safe enough to risk seeing the humanity in the other. It will come by being humble enough to recognize our own contributions to the world's conflicts. And thank you.
First of all, I want to thank Chetan for this invitation. And unlike many of you, this is my first time at UNDP conference. So, as you can see, the title of my talk is Religion and Violent Extremism and Anthropological Perspective from India. So I look at interfaith dialogue, but from a different angle. I take it as a fact that interfaith dialogue is an everyday reality in the Indian context. There are also planned interfaith dialogues by organizations, and there are many, including, for example, Jamaat-e-Islami. So the question for me is not whether interfaith dialogue exists, but how this dialogue is hampered in some ways by a variety of actors. My focus here would be on the media. So let me first spell out the source of my talk. I had the opportunity to speak with a few terrorists after their release from jail. Earlier, for my fieldwork, which was about my PhD, I had interviewed many students and activists of Students Islamic Movement of India, SIMI. So the acronym from now onwards I will be using SIMI, which was banned within 2 weeks after 9/11 on the charges of terrorism, sedition, and destroying Indian nationalism. I take it as very important that credible empirical research is necessary for any serious discussion. Anthropologist Thomas Erickson holds that a concept like globalization has no meaning to an anthropologist unless it can be studied through actual persons, their relationship to each other, and to a larger surrounding world. The same applies to the concept of terrorism, and in some ways, the concept note of UNDP's call for evidence-based approach to me is strikingly similar. I want to draw your attention to key assumption of the concept note as well as the UN General Assembly's plan of action to prevent violent extremism. First, both these documents stress the role of media in preventing violent extremism. Second, both also assume, if only by reiterating to the contrary, that religiously inspired violent extremism is the main challenge. The second premise is confirmed by a recent study which says that there is an overwhelming focus upon violent Islamist extremism in academic and non-academic literature. My contention here is that media is equally a driver of violent extremism. So let me illustrate this through my research on SIMI. Established in 1976, SIMI was a tiny organization. In 1977, its members, and they were called Ansar, they numbered 132. And the number of sympathizers was 5,000. They were called Ikhwan. In 1996, the number of Ansar was 413. So imagine the total population of India, out of which 413 is so insignificant. So given the lack of data from 1997, even a generous estimate would not put SIMI's membership beyond 1,000 in 2001 when it was banned. And yet, media projected as if every second Muslim was a SIMI activist. Media also projected every SIMI activist that the police arrested, as the most wanted. So for many months, like the most wanted had become such a commonplace thing. Now contrast this with media's boycott of United Nations resolution. After 9/11, the UN passed a resolution condemning Islamophobic violence, but not a word about it appeared anywhere in the press, nor was it mentioned on any Indian TV channel. Of course, ideology is important, but let us note that CIMI was not a secret organization. It had a published constitution, it had public library, it used to hold seminars and conferences. So the key question is, how did suddenly its ideology become terrorist in 2001? One CIMI terrorist was arrested because the police alleged that he had stuck a poster which showed Indian flag in tatters. The truth was that the poster had no flag of India. For lack of evidence, the court acquitted him, but he had already spent 27 months in jail. According to the media again, Indian Mujahideen, a new terror organization, sprang from CIMI. However, if you read the media accounts, these accounts are very clashing and contradictory. So for example, one think tank publication claimed that Indian Mujahideen, I will use IM, was conceived at a terrorist conclave in May 2008. But it did not find it contradictory when in the next paragraph it wrote, IM came into being, IM came into the open for the first time in November 2007. So as for the evidence about organizations like IM, let me quote a strategic affairs analyst when he was asked in a media interview about the IM's plan to carry out terrorist attack in India, whether it was a myth or not. He said, and I quote, IM project has been referred to not just by Indian writers and media. This is beginning to figure in the writings of a lot of international academic experts who have recently published books and documents, end of quote. Interestingly, there is one key Indian journalist source on IM, and it is that journalist who also blamed Muslims for terrorist attacks on mosques and other Muslim places. The facts were obviously the opposite. And it is the same journalist which all the international analysts writing on IM cite. So my point is, the discourse of terrorism exists without evidence. What Indian media did was, if we can put it in historical perspective, was similar to the American media in the early 20th century. Hearst and Pulitzer newspaper published front page stories about white female slaves in custody of the Chinese. A scores of books were published to show the existence of white female slave. In the best-selling book, The House of Bondage, Kaufman wrote, and I quote, "If proof was needed, newspapers have proved. I have written only what I have seen myself," end of quote. In reality, not a single case of white female slave was established. Now, a few words about religion and terrorism. In his book, Old and New Terrorism, Peter Newman contends that there is a new terrorism after 9/11, and one fundamental feature of that new terrorism he describes that it is religiously inspired. Newman goes on to say that though religiously inspired terrorism can be found in all faiths, in practice, Islamic terrorism has defined the current age. But one of the things that strikes me is, how does one know what is religion and not religion? In what case something is described as secular or not secular? In anthropology, at least, this secular religious binary has been critiqued more widely. And this literature shows what is classified as religious or secular is not innocent of power relations. As we know, media initially described the Oslo attack as terrorist and blamed it on Muslims. Once it was clear that the killer was Breivik, the term terrorist was withdrawn, and Breivik became a mass murderer or a psychopath at best. So, how do we know Breivik's acts were not religious? This is partly because different definitions are used. And reading some documents, I was wondering what would be the rationale for UN to leave the definition of terrorism and violent extremism to a member state and at the same time invoke the power of shared principles, purposes, and values. Are not shared principles and values sufficient to formulate a universal definition? And how can there be an action plan without a definition? In 1970s, going back to my Indian case, India's information minister, led by V.C. Shukla, he defended the recitation of Tulsi Das's Ramcharitmanas on radio station, arguing that it was folk culture, not religion. So let me state, my point is not about the recitation itself, but the justification given for its recitation. So at stake here is who defines what is religious and not religious. When does something gets defined as religion or culture? In late 2013, a former Simi activist was arrested for a terrorist blast in North India. The police made a raid, and this guy was arrested in the same town where my parents now live. So after the police raid on his house, newspaper headlines read, "Islamic books seized from the house of the terrorist." After a few days, he was released, and when I met him, he showed me the shelf where, along with the Quran, there were also copies of Gita, Vedas, Ramayana, and the Bible. And one key reason he had those books, because he actively did interfaith dialogue, for which he read those books. So some of you who might have watched the documentary called He Named Me Malala will recall what Malala said about Taliban. And this is a quote: "Taliban were not about faith, they were about power." And I take her statement seriously because it doesn't seem to be religiously inspired. So before we begin inter-religious dialogue, I propose there should be also inter-political dialogue. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for this exciting discussion, particularly that people have taken some food and the enzymes are already working. So we need to dialogue with our eyes wide open. I want to say I come from a story of a former in the sense that I lost my hand fighting the Muslims in Nigeria in 1992. So that's why I have to shake you with the left hand. And for those who saw that, in some culture, especially the Islamic culture, it is very difficult to dialogue with one hand, especially when it is right hand. You give the left, it means bad omen. So I struggle to apologize every day. We come from a background where at the moment as we speak to you, over 2 million illegal firearms are in Nigeria among young people and old people, all in the guise of defense. These are propelled by other factors: political, religious, insurgency, cultism, pipeline vandalization, armed robbery, community clashes, cattle rustling. Over 70% of illegal small arms and light weapons are in West Africa are in Nigeria, according to the experts. Almost 3 million small arms and light weapons are in Nigeria from June 2006 to December 2015. About 94,470 deaths recorded, almost affecting states like Borno, Benue, Lagos, Rivers, Delta, the federal capital, and Anambra. We have a little program that we are running with the gracious magnanimity of USAID called Tolerance Project, which we are focusing 6 states in Nigeria. The program was written before the escalation of the insurgency in northeast Nigeria. So quite a chunk of the states that are supposed to be addressed by our intervention are not. And so the need to escalate that. So having said this and given the background of where I come from and my former hate that was propelled by the programming I have experienced through religious leaders who have taught me the other is the enemy, sending us to the battleground while not engaging themselves directly. It's an eye-opener to the fact that one can be manipulated and mind controlled by simple narratives taken out of context from a religious text to inflict injury and demonize the other. So having said this, we are expecting to be dialoguing with Imam, and this is a very hard one. But Imam, I don't know what you want to say to me in retaliation for my hostility, for taking the stage before you.
I think very important for us, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim, distinguished Your Excellencies and distinguished brothers. I want to greet you with the greeting of peace in my tradition by saying Assalamu alaikum. It simply means may the peace and blessing be with you all.
But Imam, that is the Christian type of greeting, because Jesus said when you go to a house, say peace be unto this house. And if there are people of peace, they will reciprocate your greetings. I think it was stolen by Muslims.
Yeah, but because he didn't put it to action, that's how we put it to action and become our property. So I think that's a good one from that particular directions. But one important thing I think people should need to know is we are much more practitioners, not academicians and professors like our colleagues on the other side of the table. So what we really want to share with you is to let you know what have we been able to do. First and foremost, what are the drivers, the feeders, and the sustaining factor of religion being hijacked for violent extremism. And what are we doing from our own directions to be able to address those key important things. And before he says anything, you know, we have religion is religion. I always say anywhere we have the opportunity that religion is not the problem. We have no problem with religion. It is the drivers of the religion that become the problems. It's like having a car. You know, there are only 2 cars in the world. My friend is fond of that car. He said the Mercedes and others, you know. So when you have a nice Mercedes-Benz car and you're on the way and you give it to a drunken driver, and the drunken driver bang that Mercedes car to the wall, do you blame the Mercedes car or the drunken driver? I think the drunken driver needs to be blamed, not the car. And the same applies for us. What we have noticed in our experience of 21 working, religious leaders are classified into 3 important categories. What you call the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good, the bad, and the ugly, yes. Who are the bad? The incapable religious leaders. Just came out of Religious Institute University. He has not contextualized the knowledge in the light of his society in contextual framework. He went to the field and started giving fatwa. Everybody, it's either halal or haram. And he failed to know between halal and haram, there are 5 important stages before you take a judgment. But you just see it white or black. That is incapable religious leaders. Who is that? Who is the ugly religious leaders?
Yeah, thank you very much, Imam. I think the ugly religious leaders, as Imam will always teach me to say, is that religious leader who understands the context, but deliberately, because of the resources and the support he gets, he turns religions into an entrepreneurship venture. Pay me the bill and I will halalize or haramrize. I will make it good or bad. depending on who pays the highest bill. So we have people who want followership, and deliberately they go to manipulate their followers while on stage to think differently. But in the corners of their rooms, they also express it differently. So this Imam has always told me are the ugly.
And the ideal, tell them the ideal now before I
Okay, Imam also said I should talk about the ideal. You know, he's my teacher. So please rate me well now or otherwise. We are making this joke because it's difficult to wake people up. but we hope we are trying. The ideal ones are quite few, and they are intimidated by the minority who sometimes attack them for saying that which is right. They know what is right, and they try to prescribe that which is right, but there are very few. But they are majority, but intimidated by very few, who otherwise are seen as champions of the faith, but actually doing more harms to the faith.
And I think with this, why does minority hijack the value of our religion? In terms of interpretation of texts and scriptures, there are 5 important key drivers of giving a fatwa or a jurisprudence or a basis for your intervention in our religious discourse. 1 is the scriptural text. You have to have a scriptural basis for your interpretation or for whatever you want to engage as far as you are engaging in any social discourse. Where your basis, the scripture become the first basis. And then the second important basis, of course, which people have is what we call the legislative basis. What are the consensus of the jurisprudence and term of what is the Sharia that is agreed in written form, coded form of saying if you do X and this is the punishment is Z, which is agreed upon. And in coming to that conclusion of the second important phenomenon are the driving force. And then the third one is what we call the historical context, the historical analog, the historical direction. Why does it come into that? They say, yes, it is there in the scripture, but the history is that they find a historical justification for moving back into extreme, into what we call using violence as a means of attaining or achieving certain goal. And then the third important one is the contextual basis. Are we now, for example, with the Muslim tradition, are we Muhammad in Mecca or Muhammad in Medina? Because there is different context between Muhammad in Mecca, where you live within within a predominantly state of war, where you are about wiping out a community of Muslims, and Muhammad in Medina, which is a multicultural, multi-religious setting, which was mostly known with Medinan Charter. So you have this now, the contextual framework of putting a context of a scripture or a hadith or legislative form saying, where are we? No, here is Muhammad in Makkah. We are the state of war. We have to fight with them. They are the enemy. We are. No, Muhammad is in Medina, so he become my friend. I will always remember the historical context of the Abyssinian Treaty, where Muslims were sent to Ethiopia. There is a Christian king, a just Christian king. This narrative come to play. And outside that, there are what we call the socio-cultural dimension, where we see some of our leaders see it from the cultural context of what is agreed as the norms within the Muslim society, even though there is no basis for it within the scriptural text or the legislative text. This becomes the driving force from Islam, why it's becoming difficult, why the incapable and mischievous religious leaders find a basis to shift people into violent extremism, which we have. But in the Christian tradition,
we do have quite some challenges too in trying to get some Christians to follow the path of dialogue. I come from the Pentecostal background. I'm an Assemblies of God church priest. And it is our way or not the other at all, just one way. It became a big task to get some of my evangelical brothers and sisters to join this, I don't want to use crusade, to join this movement of wanting to dialogue with the other. Occasions in Nigeria where I had been confronted by some evangelical ministers who said to me, James, you preach well on television, bravo, but your relationship with the Muslim we hate. And people are talking from historical issues, unhealed memories, collective memories that have not been healed, deprivation as misconceived by many. Everybody in the Nigerian context is marginalized. Even everyone thinks marginalized. So we come from a narrative of purifying ourselves and castigating the other. So the difficulty in our theology to address the other is a key thing because we lack inclusive theology. The theology is about us, me, ourselves. The thinking of the other and humanizing the other is a very big challenge. And so we are confronted by that, and we are kind of isolated by a few number of religious personalities who feel our model is not the best. And that was when we started in the year 1995. We were quite lonely in this. But with the insurgents and the escalation of violence, we have proliferation of religious groups doing interfaith dialogue. We usually will say the more the merrier. But then too many cooks spoil the soup. Those that are engaged in need to be mentored, like the former team, Dr. Fatih has said, putting together religious personalities to address issues of violent extremism. I want to pause here to say the efforts is now being taken by even the very high-level leaders in Nigeria. But with every sense of humility, sometimes they talk more at that high level. It's not penetrating, and hence our strategy, Imam.
And I think one of the key important strategy, before we go into strategy, is to remind people that those sustaining factors, specifically, which have to do with youth who are engaged in this. I'm very happy the morning session mentioned some of those important things. It is the search for meaningful purpose of life. Meaningful purpose of life. How do I become the ideal? How do I get to become the best? It is not about just the other way. And then the second one is about finding solution to impunity and corrupt practices by the state actors. The search for solution for those important things. And of course, there's the issue of always standing for alternative political processes. These have been key important core issues that make people to go. And that's why when you look at the drivers of violent extremism in Nigeria and around part of the world, the key drivers, the pilots, they are not ignorant. They are not the Almajiris you think of. And I know Dr. Fatima will tell you this clearly. They are not the Almajiri you think who doesn't know how to read and write. They know how to use the machine. They are more digital than some of us who are born BBC, born before computer, you know. Most of us are BBC here. We are born before the computer age. So these digital children, you know, they know how to manipulate the computers. They finish from the best university in the countries and the best university around the world. Some of them are from middle-class family. Some of them are from the billionaires. Their parents are excessively rich. They live in London, like the case of Omar Mutalab, the son of a billionaire in Nigeria who lived in a posh house in London, but he was still thinking of, and then he took off arms to go into that. You start wondering, what does this guy need? He has everything abroad. He has everything to make a life better. Why did he choose this? Finding driven purpose of meaning to make a life a meaningful thing. And those guys there offer a technical solution. And that's why we need to look at these things from a key important perspective of saying, if really, we really want to work, it's not looking at the issue of ignorance, the issue of poverty as the driving seat. Poverty is not. But they war people who are from poverty, wooing them to be foot soldiers. But the real engine house and the sustaining factors, in our own case, as we can be able to see, and across the north and other parts of the world, there are those who are really, who attend the best university you can think of even though from the Middle East, some of them, of course, my sister mentioned the Wahhabi brand of educational system to which some of them belongs to, and they are the drivers, because they form not only the reformists, they move from reformist movement to puritanic movement. Yeah. Everybody is evil, everybody is wrong except they. And the puritanic process is becoming a difficult challenge. I came from a background of a Sufi, then into a reformist movement, but not the Puritan. And they feel, Ashafa, you have the opportunity, come, let's just crush them out. This is evil. Tell the world, you have access to the media. You have these challenges day in, day out, because some of them are from our pride. But what exactly do we do as an organization?
Okay, very succinctly, we have constipation of what to say, but unfortunately, time is really against us, and prioritizing is now a challenge. We have had occasions to talk with quite a number of people across Africa. Our strategy in Chad to preventing violence, reprisal attack on the CAR challenge, where people were moving northwards to Chad, engaging religious leaders to dialogue. What will you do in an ideal situation? And the Mullah, the Grand Mufti of Chad, was quite supportive. Our initial romance with Chad was under the auspices for UNDP supporting our intervention in Chad. Following that good intervention, it really stopped reprisal. And of course, in Kenya, a few of an African answer, if you do have, you can Google AAA, AAA, an African answer. It's an African solution to African challenges. We do feel that we can have support from the global north, but the African model might be useful if it is quite used. So religious leaders addressing post-election violence. And so it is versatility and flexibility, capacity to meander through the needs of the people using their culture and context to address challenging emerging issues. We also understand that even in Nigeria, there was denial initially on the Chibok abduction. We were actually first to meet with the Chibok 57 girls to give them what we call faith-based psychosocial therapy. Faith-based is different from the psychotherapy that you have, but this is invoking our spirituality to address issues of emotions, and we find it very effective with the Chibok girls and handling their parents who actually are having no hope of seeing their daughters. We do not know what have become of them, but we have some discussion with some people somewhere who have some thoughts about where they may be, but we are not quite sure. And the channel of discussion has been has been abrogated, abolished by the reason of sometimes lack of political will on the part of the government that was, and not understanding who might be the genuine negotiator or mediators, and classifying everybody as somebody that's out for the money. And then I can see that we are really pressed with time, but I will say a few things, and my colleague will say, we have seen that in order to address these things, Imam, we thought of interfaith theology of communication, and then establishing an interfaith peace radio where religious leaders will come frequently to dialogue on thorny issues that is based on value and how to soften and massage those contextual scriptures that seems to be ambiguous and open to different kind of interpretation. I just said one.
One of the key important things, this is what we want to do. What he jumped to what we want to do is to have that interfaith peace radio. But what we are doing is demystifying scriptural text. Demystifying scriptural text that seems to promote, that seem ambiguous, and that seem to promote hate and division across the line. There's a lot of scriptural texts in the Quran and the Bibles because of the incapability of the knowledge of the drivers and the greed that possess the mischievous drivers. They bring out those texts and be able to use them, just give them a literal interpretation, quoting them out of context. One of the things we do is we don't deny the others, we don't confront, but we present this. We have a network, what we call early warning, early response system. We have what we call community peace action network. And from those action network across the states where we are working, specifically in 6 states now, and across our members across, we send this blast to say, these are the scriptures really refer to this it. And say, you have no connection with the Christians. We bring our scriptural text, the Surah Rome, the chapter Rome in the Holy Quran that talk about solidarity with the Roman Christian king when they were subdued by the Byzantium Empire. And Muhammad is saying, no, our brothers are in difficulty. Very soon, the power will return. God will return back Rome to our Christian brethren. This was in the 7th century. And we bring them out to say, you can see have solidarity with Christian tsunamis happen in Christian or in India or far away because Muhammad has example. These are some of the texts we brought out and be able to use them collectively in creating another narrative, a preventive narrative, a counter narrative to narrative that divide, to narrative that include us among the others. Apart from that, we talk about one important thing under that is some of the project our sister Fatima was doing when she was with the National Security Advisor's Office. But before then, we have our own program of what we call the de-radicalization. We call it reprogramming and deprogramming. Deprogramming of the militancy and reprogramming of the youth who are potential danger of recruiting wing for BH and other extreme in our community. We run this program across universities, across informal sector, within the madrasa, Islamic theology, and seminarians, where we connect with them to run this program on the grassroots. So they'll be able to have a broad thinking and inclusive thinking instead of exclusive thinking of their own communities. Apart from this, so
we do have a program that we want to start with religious institutions where imams and pastors are produced. One of them, Fatima has mentioned, there are quite few for Muslims clerics to come out, but in terms of the Christian theological institutions to develop curriculum of communication, interfaith communication theology, where you will be given how to relate with the other without putting the other down. And of course, there is a plan also to scale up our work among religious leaders. We are collaborating with the Christian Association of Nigeria, Jamaat al-Nasr Islam, and Supreme Council of Religious Affairs. We are also dialoguing with AU in order to scale up the work in Africa under the interfaith groups, especially we have our ambassador Hailu Mozi from United Religious Initiative based in at the UN, which we are working with in Addis Ababa, I mean AU I say, in Addis Ababa, in order to see how we can permit the nook and cranny of the African continent. And our work to prevent recruitment and then to prevent hate and dangerous speeches. Recently, the Kaduna State government has sent an executive bill in order for him to license preachers who usually come and preach inflammatory messages. Both Christians and Muslim communities kicked against the bill. And as we speak now, the Muslim communities have taken the governor to court to stop him from enacting that bill into law. So the Christians also were to be on mass protest on the streets against the same bill, and so we were part of those who told the Christians not to go on the protest. It might mean violence because crowd control is a case in religious movement. So that has been stopped, but there is a lot of consultations now within religious groups, and I see collaboration now between the Muslims and Christians over what they see as infringing on their rights, and that government will license preachers before they begin to preach. So the bill was exclusive of some other Christian groups and Muslim groups, like the Ahmadiyya movement. The Shia groups are not inclusive, and then the Jehovah Witnesses, the Church of the Latter-day Saints, like Mormons and Mormons or Mormons, as the case may be, and the Sabbatarians are not included in that bill. And so we had proposed a wider consultation, and we're happy to work with the government. But around Nigerian states in the north, we have been working with House of Assemblies to promote a bill on religious tolerance, and which part of it is hate speech. These are done to reduce narratives that can lead to mass atrocities. So part of this is quite what we want a lot of people here to partner, and in the Africa we want to see all those things coming forward, and the teams that are coming up for mentoring in East Africa. We are happy to continue the work there. And I think for us, identifying those theological institutions to partner with is quite key to resolving the challenges that may be facing the religious communities in future.
I think one important thing that is we want to add, and this is what has to do with the UNDP, from our experience on the UN and other international communities, USAID and others, is the use of religious leaders. You know, the mediation thing, the process of mediations and mediating most of these difficult conflict situations and putting them is getting the ideal religious leaders on the front runner. How do we help to get them there? We did it in Kaduna after the 2000-2002 crisis. Over 2,000 people lost their lives. And religious leaders come and sign the peace treaty. And they move in the forefront for resolutions. And because they lead for 11 good years, for 9 good years, there have been no any conflict in Kaduna. This is what we saw. We did it in Plateau, as far as much as Plateau is burning, in the southern senatorial zone of Plateau, in the city called Yelwa. We bring the religious leaders to sign a peace treaty and to lead in the mediation process, to lead those youths who are on the extreme violent level. And when they come, it's like God is there. Those youth, some of those youth move back because they feed on the identity of our religious values. And the custodian of religious values seem to say, no, it's not there. You can't do this. And the using of media is another important component, which we do and which we use. We saw the values. And that's why we will say one of the important things for me is that if the UN will be able to activate its track 2 diplomacy and look at non-state actors, here faith-based organizations, religious leadership, bring them to forefront of confronting or readdressing those narratives that are really dividing us, that some of our children get access to and be able to use them against us. This is just a little from the little some of our experiences in the last 21 years, moving around different parts of the world and sharing this at the grassroots level. Thank you very much.